Her. She's the one who stole my money. Give it back, you thieving bitch!
Take your hand off me, or you'll lose it!
They laughed, giving him a wild girl. But she became the best shot in town. The wind howled like the roar of a starving beast, crawling over the scorched face of the desert, clawing at every grain of sand, as if it meant to strip the flesh off anyone who dared to enter. The air was thick, so thick that every breath felt like swallowing hot ash, making every sound beyond the wind seem distant, warped. The yellow-brown of the sand was no longer a color. It had become a suffocating shroud, swallowing everything whole, blurring the line between earth and sky. Dust rose in savage bursts, twisting into vicious spirals around low, scraggly shrubs, which swayed like wretched souls writhing in the wasteland. In the madness of sand and wind, far off, a figure emerged, a smear of memory at first, slowly taking shape. She rode a black horse, thin to the bone, its coat streaked with sweat-darkened sand, its legs trembling but gripping the treacherous ground. Her hair, once strands that had caught the glow of sunset, was now clumped and heavy with grit and sweat, tangled under a tattered scarf wrapped hastily around her nose and mouth to keep the breath in. Beneath brows dusted gray, her eyes burned like embers, clawing their way back to life in a damp ash pit, the only light left in this merciless world. Cora Cinder Hayes, once just a whisper in saloon corners, had become a trail for hunters to follow, a shadow the desert swallowed and spat back out, as if testing her will to survive. The horse stumbled, its breath ragged, every inhale tearing at its chest. Cora leaned forward, her calloused hand stroking its neck, feeling the frantic hammer of its heartbeat. Her time was leaking away like the last drops from a cracked canteen, precious and cruel. Somewhere behind, buried under the shriek of the wind, she heard it, hoofbeats. At first faint, then steady, pounding with the sure rhythm of predators who had already caught the scent. They were closing in, too close. She couldn't stop, not now. Not when the end waiting behind her was a pair of rough hands and a tightening noose. She needed a town, any town, just a wall, a shadow, an alley narrow enough to hide her and her horse from the hunger at her back. And today, the sandstorm, once her enemy, had turned. Arms of dust spread wide to cloak her, blur her trail, cut off the scent. The wind, in its mad roaring, had become her only ally. Through the spinning haze of grit, Cora caught sight of something different in color, a smear of dull gray breaking the tyranny of yellow. Oakhaven, a small town that looked slapped together from weather-beaten boards and rotting dreams. From a distance, it was nothing more than a crack in the land, an empty promise, a resting place for the rootless. But to Cora, in this moment, it was the faintest flicker of hope, the only raft in an ocean of sand. The hoofbeats behind her sounded again, clearer now, so close she could almost feel the wind carry their breath to the back of her neck. She tightened the reins, leaned forward, pressing her lips near the horse's ear. Her voice was raw, barely a whisper carried through the storm. "Just a little more, girl, just a little more." The horse's trembling legs found one last surge, as if it too understood that what lay ahead was the line between life and death. Oakhaven didn't promise much, only crooked walls, dusty streets, and half-shut doors full of suspicion. But to Cora, it was enough to vanish, enough for her to once again become nothing more than a shadow slipping through memory, disappearing before anyone could ask her name. And she knew, when the sun dipped behind those lopsided rooftops, she would be gone again, like always. The air in Oakhaven was thick with the smells of dry wood, stale sweat, cheap beer, and the faint, earthy tang of dust just settled. The sandstorm had blown through since early morning, but it left behind a thin, yellowed crust over every rooftop, every window, and the main street itself crunching under each step like brittle glass. Cora led her weary horse into the stable near the town's gate. She hadn't even fastened the reins when a heavy-set man stepped out of the shadows, his mustache caked with sand and sweat. His narrow eyes swept her from the brim of her wide hat down to her dust-caked boots. "Your horse needs looking after," he said gruffly, without the courtesy of a greeting. Cora gave a slight nod, pulling a silver coin from her coat pocket, her calloused fingers trembling faintly from the cold. "Please," she replied, her voice hoarse, like someone who'd just crossed a long stretch of wind and grit. "What brings you here?" the man asked, not just curious, but with an edge of suspicion so blatant it weighed in the air. "Just passing through for the night," Cora said coldly, her eyes unblinking. "We don't have room for stray drifters," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. She didn't answer. Words here would only waste her breath. With one hand still gripping the reins, she walked straight into town. Behind narrow curtains, eyes flicked toward her, quick and furtive, yet heavy enough for her to feel their weight. She was used to it. Her life had been a string of escapes, and every unfamiliar face was a possible threat. Then a shout split the air. "Her! She's the one who stole my money." Cora spun around, startled, but before she could react, footsteps pounded in around her. A crowd formed, eyes gleaming like they'd just found a new form of entertainment. Out of the throng, a tall, broad-bellied man surged forward, his faded shirt straining over his gut, a massive hand clamping down on her shoulder. "Give it back, you thieving bitch," he growled, his breath reeking of liquor and spoiled meat. Cora felt heat rise to her temples, humiliation and outrage knotting into a solid lump in her throat. Her eyes flashed steel. "Take your hands off me," she said, her voice cold and sharp, like a blade freshly honed. "What?" he barked, a laugh full of scorn. "You little brat, giving me orders?" The back and forth fed the crowd's hunger. Whispers rippled through them. "Bet it's her. Look at the way she's dressed, tells you what kind she is. Probably a runaway whore." They didn't need to shout. Each word was sharp enough to cut flesh. In that moment, Cora didn't feel fear, but the pressure closing in made her chest tighten. She knew, in towns like this, reason meant nothing compared to the collective thrill of having someone to condemn. Then a voice cut through the noise, low, steady, and clear. Not shouted, yet it carried through the clamor. "That's enough." The crowd shifted slightly. Elias Thorne stood there. He was tall, lean, his skin the pale gray of someone long deprived of sleep, and his deep blue eyes held a look that seemed to contain an entire desert's worth of drought inside them. His clothes were plain, a white shirt frayed at the collar, dark trousers, dusted boots, but something about him carried a quiet authority that needed no announcement. Elias didn't look at the crowd. His gaze locked on Cora, not accusing, not exactly protective, but as though he were trying to work out some strange puzzle standing before him. "Let her be," he said, his tone so calm it felt as if no one else existed there but the two of them. "Oakhaven doesn't need violence." Low. The beer-bellied man shoved at Elias's shoulder. "Step aside, Doc. This one's a thief." "Whoever she is," Elias replied, still steady but with each word falling like a stone to the ground, "you can't pass judgment without a shred of proof." He wasn't some hero gunslinger, not a knight riding in to save her. He wasn't throwing himself between her and the claws of the town. He was just holding the line, keeping order, doing what he believed was right in his own way. But for Cora, surrounded by cold eyes and baseless accusations, that small act felt like a rare crack in the wall pressing down on her. She looked at him, then at the crowd, and something unfamiliar slipped in, not gratitude, not trust, but a kind of curiosity. The dangerous kind. Sure, here's the translation of the provided Vietnamese text into American English. The sky looked as if it had caught fire, deep red, like an open wound bleeding across the horizon. The sunset spilled over Oakhaven, bathing the town in a false warmth, the kind that made every crease in a face stand out and every curl of a smirk look sharper, meaner. Evening wind swept through the main street, stirring the thin layer of sand left from the morning storm, carrying the dry taste of dust mixed with sweat and cheap beer. From the warped wooden doors of the saloon, Silas stepped out. The red light slid over his face, stretching the jagged scar that ran from his cheekbone to his jaw, making him look like some old wolf who'd just caught the scent of blood. He stared hard at Cora, then flicked his eyes to Elias, a half-smile curling at one corner of his mouth. "I've got an idea," he said, slow enough for everyone to hear. "If she can hit 5 bottles on the fence, she walks free. If she misses, she leaves town. Tonight." A roar of laughter burst from the crowd, spilling out like spilled beer on dry boards. They looked at Cora, small, slight, coat dusty from the road, and no one truly believed she could hit even one bottle. Murmurs slithered through the air. Probably couldn't hit a barn door. Bet she's never even held a gun. Cora didn't flinch. She locked eyes with Silas. That's it? Her voice was cold steel. Silas gave an easy shrug, as if doing her a favor. That's it. Lo. Elias took a step forward, his gaze fixed on her. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice carrying a thread of worry and something else. Cora turned to him. Do you trust me? In that instant, Elias hesitated. In his eyes was a war he didn't know if he could trust her, but he couldn't bring himself not to. I don't know, he admitted, each word slow, heavy. She nodded once. Then watch closely. Live. She strode to the open stretch of dirt in the center of town, where a weathered fence ran along the edge. Silas strolled over, setting 5 empty bottles on the top rail, their necks trembling slightly in the evening breeze. The crowd closed in, forming a loose ring, eyes glinting with the promise of watching a clumsy little show. Cora drew her revolver from her hip, a battered old thing, steel dulled by years, yet cared for with a devotion that showed in its balance and the soft gleam where her hand had worn the grip smooth. She said nothing, only stood tall, her breathing steady, the noise of the crowd falling away like dust on the wind. Ready? Silas asked, mockery dripping from the word. Cora gave a small nod. Then she raised the gun smooth as water, quick and exact, without a wasted motion. The first shot cracked the air. Bang! The first bottle shattered, glass sparkling in the blood-red light. Bang! The second bottle exploded, the crowd's laughter faltering. Bang! The third was gone, and silence began to creep in, replacing the jeers. Bang! The fourth fell, hitting the ground with a short, sharp clink. A breathless pause hung in the air, tight as a drawn bowstring. Bang! The last bottle burst apart, shards raining down like silver in the fading light. The sound of breaking glass didn't just echo, it declared itself. Cora lowered the gun, gave her wrist a slow twist, then blew a thin curl of smoke from the barrel. Her eyes swept over the crowd, each glance a silent cut. No one spoke, no one laughed. The faces that had been eager for a spectacle now looked caught off guard, stripped of their smug certainty by 5 short bursts that had wiped it all away. The corner of Cora's mouth lifted not a smile, but the mark of someone who knew she'd just crushed every doubt in the room. Her eyes said what her lips didn't. Told you so. That evening, the air was cool, and the scent of charcoal and grilling filled Oakhaven. People were still talking about Cora. News of the wild girl had spread throughout the town. Cora sat alone in the corner of the bar, sipping a glass of whiskey. She didn't care about the staring eyes. She was used to it. She was a stranger. She had always been a stranger. Elias sat alone at his own table. He was reading a book, but his eyes kept glancing toward Cora. He couldn't understand her. He couldn't understand why a young girl had such a skill with a gun, and why she had such a cold exterior. She was a wild beast, an unbroken horse. Silas walked over to Cora's table and placed a new glass of whiskey down. You did well, he said. I didn't think you could do it. Cora took a sip of whiskey. I didn't do it for your praise. I know, Silas said, his tone becoming serious. I saw a young girl who can fight, and we need someone like you. Cora shook her head. I don't want to stay here. You won't have to stay, Silas said. But we need you. Have you heard about the Barlow gang? Cora nodded. I've heard. I've always heard about them. They're getting bolder, Silas said. They're raiding farms and threatening trade routes. And we have no one to protect ourselves. Cora stood up. That's not my problem, but it will become your problem, Silas said. Once we need someone to fight, we'll need you. Cora didn't say anything. She just looked at Silas, then at Elias. She could feel their need. She could feel their fear. But she couldn't help them. She couldn't help anyone. She could only save herself. A week later, Oakhaven was still wrapped in that heavy, unnatural quiet, the kind that everyone knew wouldn't last, like the surface of a pond lying still while something swirled deep beneath. Fear of the Barlow gang had worked its way down every street, slipped under every roof, making folks talk softer and glance over their shoulders more often. Cora was caught in that same current, though she didn't let it slow her steps. She'd taken work on Elias's ranch reluctantly, not because she wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. A roof over her head, a few hot meals, and a place to disappear from prying eyes, that was all she needed. That afternoon, sunlight stretched thin gold ribbons across the weathered fence line. Cora was replacing a broken plank, the thock of her hammer steady as a heartbeat. Her shirt clung damp to her back, sweat tracing slow paths from the nape of her neck down the line of her spine. Stray strands of hair clung to her temple, curling against skin flushed from the sun. A shadow stretched long across the dirt. Elias stepped up, the dust on his boots whispering against the ground. He set a water jug at her feet. "Drink," he said, his voice low, half command, half something softer. Cora looked up, swiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, meeting his gaze with a look that was equal parts guarded and defiant. She took the jug and drank deep. Cool water washed the dryness from her throat, and when she lowered it, his eyes were still on her, steady, measuring, waiting for something. "You don't have to worry about me," she said, her voice rough from heat and dust. One corner of Elias's mouth twitched, a flicker of something amused in his eyes. "I'm not worried about you," he said, pausing just long enough for the edge to sink in. "I'm worried about the fence. It needs fixing, and I can't do it alone." Her hand stilled for a fraction, eyes narrowing just slightly before she turned back to her work. "Then you do yours," she said flatly, without looking at him. It was his turn to be caught off guard. He'd expected a joke, maybe a softening of that cool stare, but instead, she gave him her back and the steady rhythm of the hammer. And somehow, that quiet refusal made him stay, watching longer than he meant to. "Why are you so good with a gun?" he asked finally, not just curious, but testing the ground. Cora paused mid-swing, turning toward him slowly, eyes narrowing as though weighing if the question deserved an answer. "Why are you a doctor?" The question landed sharp and quick, and for a moment he had no answer. She held his gaze direct, unflinching, and the silence between them stretched, thick enough to feel. Her mouth curved into the faintest, sardonic smile. "We learn what we have to in order to survive. That's all." Elias nodded, but didn't look away. "I get it," he said, and this time there was no challenge in his tone, only acknowledgement. That evening, autumn wind slipped in through the kitchen window. The glow of the oil lamp pooled gold over the rough-hewn table, glinting off the edges of chipped porcelain. They sat across from each other, the only sounds the quiet clink of spoons against bowls. Neither of them broke the silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because they were both, in their own way, enjoying it. Cora ate slowly, her eyes lifting now and then toward Elias. She noticed he was watching not just her face, but the way her fingers turned the spoon, the slight tilt of her wrist. Each time their eyes met, he didn't look away, and that made her want to, yet also made her wonder how long he'd hold the look. Elias leaned forward to refill her bowl. The space between them closed suddenly. The scent of wood and antiseptic clung to him, faint but sharp. When his hand brushed the back of hers as he passed the bowl, they both paused, not pulling away, but not moving closer either. Cora pressed her lips together, eyes dropping to the soup again, but the ghost of a smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth, a reflex she hadn't meant to show. Elias noticed, and the quiet satisfaction in his eyes made him take his seat again with unhurried ease, as if neither of them wanted to shatter the moment. When dinner was done, Cora rose to clear the table. Elias followed, carrying dishes to the porch. The night wind stirred the curtain, the boards beneath their feet creaking faintly. They stood close enough for warmth to pass between them, but still with that sliver of space thin enough that a single step could close it. Cora's eyes lingered on the dark sweep of the fields. Elias's gaze stayed on her profile. He almost said something, then didn't. She felt the weight of his eyes and turned her head, and in that brief lock of their gaze, there was no emptiness, only the hum of something unspoken. This wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't a promise either. It was more like a spark catching on dry grass, still small, but both of them knew, without a word, that if no one stamped it out, it could burn. And for now, neither had the will to put it out. The sun had set. The sky had turned a charcoal purple. A scream rang out. "They're coming!" The sound of galloping horses and gunfire filled the air. The Barlow gang was attacking a farm on the outskirts of town. Everyone panicked. Cora and Elias were at home. Elias looked out the window, his face pale. "We have to help them," he said. "Why?" Cora asked. "That's not our problem." "You can't say that," Elias said. "They're our people." Cora looked at him. "You once helped someone, and they died. Do you want that to happen again?" Elias looked at her. She had touched his old wound. He couldn't say anything. He could only look at his pain. "I'm going," Elias said. "I'm a doctor." Cora stood up. She picked up her gun. "I'm coming with you," she said. "You can't go alone." They ran to the farm. Cora shot down a few of the bandits. She moved quickly, accurately. Elias, with his medical knowledge, saved a few of the wounded. But things were getting worse. The gang was too large. In one moment, Cora saw a bandit preparing to shoot a child. She didn't hesitate. She raised her gun, she aimed, and then she pulled the trigger. The bandit fell, and the child was saved. The child ran to her and hugged her. "Thank you," it said. Cora looked at the child, and then at Elias. She could feel a strange feeling in her heart. It wasn't pride, but a sense of relief. She had saved someone. Elias looked at her, and in his eyes she could see admiration, respect. She hadn't run away. She hadn't hidden. She had fought. After the raid, Oakhaven staggered under the weight of its own fear. The streets still carried the smell of gunpowder and churned dust, and the air hummed with the raw nerves of a town that had nearly been taken apart. Elias and Cora made their way back to the house. He moved stiffly. His shirt darkened where a bullet had grazed his shoulder, a shallow wound, but enough to remind him how close the world had come to ending. Inside, Cora guided him to the chair near the hearth. Without a word, she worked the buttons of his shirt free, the fabric sticking slightly where blood had dried. The cloth fell open, revealing the angry red scrape, and beneath it, the pale ridge of an old scar. She left him only long enough to fetch a bottle of whiskey and a strip of clean cloth. The scent of spirits filled the room as she poured it over the wound. Elias gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw flexing like cables under strain. "Why didn't you run?" he asked, voice low and rough from both pain and something else. "You've always said you would, that you'd run." Cora didn't answer at first. Her gaze lingered on that old scar, faded but not forgotten, etched into him like a mark of exile. It was the kind of scar that didn't belong to the body alone. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "No," he said, without hesitation. "It's just an old scar. Doesn't hurt anymore." "Zero." She met his eyes then, and there was no softness in her voice when she replied. "You're lying. You couldn't save her. You couldn't forgive yourself. That's why you put your gun down. That's why you're here." Elias looked at her, startled not because she was wrong, but because she was right. "How did you know?" "I know that kind of pain," Cora said quietly. "I've carried it myself. I was left behind once, and once is enough to know what it feels like." "Lay?" She wrapped the cloth firmly around his shoulder, the fabric pressing warmth into the ache beneath. Her hands were steady, her touch impersonal in motion but not in meaning. "It's going to be okay," she said, though her voice sounded like she was telling it to both of them. Later, they sat together by the fire. Outside, the night pressed cold fingers against the walls, but inside the flames licked at the logs, casting amber light that blurred the lines between shadow and skin. Neither spoke. They simply sat, two people who had found each other in the wreckage of their own storms, leaning into the quiet like it was the only safe place left. The fire crackled and shifted, sending up sparks that spiraled briefly before vanishing into the dark. It sounded almost like a promise neither dared to speak aloud, a promise that, perhaps, the worst was already behind them. That evening, the western sky looked like a torn sheet of crimson silk, its ragged edges bleeding into the horizon. The sun was sinking, still clinging to a few stubborn rays like the fingers of a dying man, unwilling to let go. The prairie stretched out before them, so still that even the wind seemed careful, threading itself through the dry grass without daring to bend it more than necessary. On the weathered wooden porch, Elias and Cora sat. Between them was a space small enough to cross with a single step, yet deep as a canyon one you could see across, but might spend a lifetime mustering the courage to cross. Cora kept her gaze low, a small stick in her hand tracing slow, uneven circles in the dusty earth. Each circle was incomplete before the wind erased it, like memories you think you can hold on to, until a thin gust is enough to sweep them away. Elias was silent for a long while, eyes fixed on the blood-red horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like a door that hadn't been opened in years. Low, weighted, carrying the scent of something old and locked away. "I once had a wife," he said, spacing the words as though afraid they might shatter on the way out. "Her name was Lily. She was kindness itself, and beautiful. The kind of beautiful that could make even the worst morning bearable, just because she smiled." He paused, throat tightening. "Then the sickness came. I saved dozens of people, but not her. That was the first time I learned how much a man's hands can shake when there's nothing left they can do." Cora's fingers clenched around the stick until it snapped with a dry crack. She didn't look up. Some griefs didn't need comfort, they split wider when touched. "I felt like I'd betrayed her," Elias went on. "Betrayed my vows, betrayed the belief that I could protect the one I loved. When she died, I walked away from everything, came to this town, thinking distance and time would wipe it all clean. But," he let out a short, humorless laugh dry as charred wood, "time just lays dust over it, the blood still underneath." Cora looked up now. In the red light of the dying sun, his face was carved into sharp planes by shadow, like a half-finished statue, something caught between strength and ruin. She reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. The touch was light, but steady, an anchor in the wind. "You didn't betray her," Cora said, her voice low and rough, as if she was keeping it from shaking. "You did everything you could. If she were still here, she wouldn't want you locking yourself away in the dark." Elias turned to her. In her eyes he saw a kind of quiet strength, a strength born only in those who had crossed the desert of loss and somehow remained standing. But deep within, he also saw a vast emptiness. "You've lost someone too," he said, softer this time, as if afraid to break whatever fragile thing had surfaced between them. Cora's mouth curved faintly, but it wasn't a smile that reached her eyes. "I never lost anyone, because I never had anyone to lose." His brow furrowed, but he said nothing. "I was an orphan," she continued, gaze drifting out over the darkening fields. "Grew up under moldy walls and the eaves of other people's roofs. Learned to fight for every scrap I ate. And I learned one thing: don't trust anyone. Don't love anyone, because sooner or later they'll leave. Or worse, they'll be taken from you. Either way, it hurts." Her words hit the porch floor like drops of lead. "Not everyone leaves," Elias said. Each word fell with the weight of a stone dropped into a deep well. He couldn't tell if it reached her or if it just vanished into the dark. Cora held his gaze for a long moment. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of something like a flame buried in ash, small but stubborn. And just as he noticed she'd seen it, she turned away, letting the wind snuff it out. Far off, the sun slipped completely below the horizon, leaving the sky bruised purple and letting the chill seep through the gaps in the wood. On the porch, they remained two people, two wounds, staring out into the same wide darkness, neither willing to take the step that would bring them to the other side. A few days later, Oakhaven woke beneath a cold, gray morning. The bad news came like a stone dropped into a deep well. Silas, Elias's closest friend, had been taken by the Barlow gang. They demanded a ransom large enough to cripple the town, and their deadline was as short as the last breath of a man with a noose tightening around his neck. "I have to go save him," Elias said, his eyes hard with resolve. "Don't," Cora shook her head. "They're too many. You'll die. I can't abandon him. He's my friend." She held his gaze for a long moment before speaking, her voice quiet but sharp as a thin blade. "Then what am I?" Elias faltered, his lips parting without conviction. "You're Cora." A faint laugh slipped from her, bitter as ash. "I'm nobody, just a stranger passing through, and I'm leaving." He reached for her, his fingers closing around her hand like a man clinging to the last rope before it slides from his grasp. "Don't go. I need you. The town needs you." Cora pulled her hand free, her eyes drifting elsewhere. "You don't need me. You need someone who'll fight for you. Someone who can mend what's broken in you. But I'm not that person." She turned her back and walked away, leaving behind the scent of cold wind and the hollow space where she had stood. Elias watched her go, feeling the air around him shrink as though the world itself were closing in. He had once lost a woman to death, and, with her, the last of his faith in himself. And now he was on the verge of losing another, not to the grave, but to the unbridgeable distance between two souls. And he knew that this time, if he let her disappear, the darkness would swallow what remained of him. Cora didn't go far. She sat on a small hill, looking down at Oakhaven. She could hear the sound of the gang's horses, the sound of gunfire. She could feel the town's fear. She could run away. She could leave. She could forget everything. But she couldn't. She had seen Elias. She had seen him, a man who had been hurt, but still tried to help others. She had seen a man who had lost everything, but still tried to find hope. She couldn't abandon him. Elias, standing on the hill, walked toward her. He looked at her. "You're not leaving?" Cora shook her head. "I can't," she said. "I can't abandon you. I can't abandon them." Elias sat down next to her. "Then we'll fight," he said. Cora nodded. "We'll fight." They sat there, talking about their plan. Cora talked about tactics. Elias talked about medicine. They were no longer two lonely people. They were a team. They were a single flame, a flame that had been lit from two smaller flames. That night, they were ready. Elias had treated his wound. Cora had loaded her gun. They had talked to each other about everything. "I couldn't save Lily," Elias said, "but I didn't give up. I couldn't trust anyone," Cora said, "but I trust you." They looked at each other, and in their eyes, they could see trust, connection. They were no longer two lonely people. They were one. And then, the sound of horses came. The Barlow gang had arrived. The battle began. Cora shot down a bandit. Elias, with his medical knowledge, saved a wounded man. They fought side by side, not because they had to, but because they had chosen to. During the battle, Cora saw Cole Barlow, the gang's leader. She didn't hesitate. She ran toward him. Elias saw her. "Cora," he yelled, "don't do it." But she didn't listen. She ran. She ran to face him. Cole Barlow looked at her. "The wild girl," he laughed. "You think you can defeat me? I'll show you," Cora said. And then they shot at each other. Gunfire filled the air. Cora shot him in the shoulder. He shot her in the arm. She fell, but she still got up. She didn't give up. She didn't run away. The sound of gunfire echoed, mixing with the screams of the town. Cora was wounded. She fell, blood flowing from her arm. Cole Barlow, with a sinister smile on his face, approached her. He aimed his gun at her head. "This is over, girl," he said. Elias saw it. He was saving a wounded man, but he left everything behind. He ran toward Cora like a wounded beast. He was no longer a doctor. He was a man trying to save the woman he loved. "No," Elias yelled. Cole Barlow turned. He aimed his gun at Elias. A shot rang out. Elias fell. Cora saw it. She felt a sense of pain, a feeling she had never felt before. Not fear, but anger. She wouldn't give up. She couldn't let him die. She stood up, blood flowing from her arm. She grabbed her gun, and she shot. She didn't aim. She just shot. The bullet flew straight into his head. Cole Barlow fell and died. Cora ran toward Elias. He was lying on the ground, blood flowing from his chest. She placed her hand on his chest. She felt his weak heartbeat. She felt fear, pain, worry. "No," she said, "you can't." She looked into his eyes, and she could see acceptance. He wasn't afraid. He just accepted it. I'm sorry," Elias said. "I couldn't save him. I couldn't save her." Cora didn't say anything. She just held him tight. She didn't cry. She couldn't cry. But something inside her had broken, like a dry piece of land had cracked, and the rainwater had begun to seep in. That evening, Oakhaven felt as if it had staggered out of a long nightmare. Gun smoke still curled above the rooftops, the scent of dust and blood seeping through door cracks, clinging to every breath. Townsfolk gathered in the street. their eyes shifting from the lifeless body of Cole Barlow to the sight of Cora kneeling beside Elias, her blood-stained hands pressing against his wound as if holding on to the one thing she could not bear to lose. For the first time, those gazes no longer cut like knives of suspicion. They lowered, quiet, like wind exhausted after a storm worn out, but accepting, conceding the strength of the woman before them. Elias lived. The bullet had only grazed his heart, leaving the searing memory of death brushing close but failing to claim him. They carried him inside. Cora, her own arm bleeding, stayed. Days later, the morning sun poured through the window slats, golden as honey across the fresh scar on his chest. Elias pushed himself upright, his eyes finding her. "You're not leaving?" Cora shook her head. "Number, I can't. Not you, not them." The light softened the ice that had once sealed her gaze. The edge of her anger was gone, replaced by a fragile, undeniable warmth. "You're not a wild horse anymore," Elias said, his voice low like a distant drumbeat. "You're Cora." Cora smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I'm still an untethered horse, and no one will ever break me." Elias stepped down, closing the distance until only a breath separated them. His voice was steady, but beneath it surged a wave too strong to hold back. "I don't want to break you," he said, eyes locking onto hers as if driving straight into her heart. "I want to walk beside you. I want to be chosen by you. I want to wake every morning knowing you're here not because you have to be, but because you want to be. I want to be the one you turn to when everything falls apart. I want all of it, and I won't accept less." "No." Cora drew in a deep breath, her pulse pounding like the gallop of a horse tearing across open plains. In his eyes there was no plea, only the fierce resolve of a man who had decided and would not turn back. She opened her mouth to speak, but Elias caught her hand, his grip firm enough that she could feel his warmth flooding into her skin. "Cora," he said, his voice roughened, "I love you. Not some vague, fleeting thing. I love you with a love that has survived blood, smoke, and the worst this world could throw at us. You can refuse me, but you'll never erase this from me." In that moment, Cora felt as if she stood on the edge between desert and oasis. Her breath caught. Every wall she'd built around herself trembled, and then she nodded, just enough for his eyes to ignite. "Then," she whispered, "I choose you." "Then—" Elias pulled her into him, and the kiss came like a sudden rain breaking over parched land, fierce, burning, erasing the last traces of distance between two people who had once been alone. One afternoon, the postman brought an envelope yellowed with age, the paper carrying the scent of late-season dry leaves. Inside, Cora's mother confessed. She had not abandoned her out of cruelty, but to save her from the brutal hands of her father. She had lived her whole life under the weight of regret. Cora read each line, her eyes traveling as though across a long desert until they found a spring. No tears fell. The anger was gone. In its place was a quiet that seeped into her chest, like spring wind slipping through an old window. She turned to Elias. "I wasn't abandoned," she said, her voice as light as a falling leaf. "I was protected, and I didn't run." Elias drew her into his arms, his hand steady against her back like the pillar of a house. "You are strong," he said. "A woman who was chosen, not owned, not tamed. You are your own." No more words were needed. The warmth of each other was the only story they required. Spring swept over Oakhaven like a green quilt laid gently across the earth's wounds. Tender grass pushed up where bullet craters had been, and wildflowers scattered their colors along freshly built fences. The town and the people within it slowly learned to breathe again. Elias and Cora rebuilt the farm together. New timber replaced rotting beams. The sound of hammers replaced the echo of gunfire. Cora was no longer an outsider. She was a helping hand, a laugh among the market stalls, a thread woven into the fabric of the town. Elias reopened his clinic. He healed the sick, and little by little, the cracks within himself. One afternoon, they sat on the porch, watching children chase each other through the grass. A little girl ran up and wrapped her arms around Cora. "Dr. Cora, you're the best doctor in the whole world." Cora laughed, a sound she once believed she'd never make again. Evening draped the rooftops in the burnished glow of old copper. Silas appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. "Oakhaven needs a symbol," he said. "Strength, resilience." Elias turned to Cora. "I think I know who." She didn't have to ask. In his gaze, she understood. The emblem of Oakhaven would not be a lone wild horse, but one who had carried wounds, stood tall, and chosen to remain. When the new welcome sign was raised, bearing her image carved into its wood, Cora smiled. It was no longer the guarded smile of a fighter ready to flee, but the steady mark of someone who had found where she belonged. On the hilltop, the evening seemed to hold its breath. The sun bled into the horizon, setting the valley below aflame with red light. Wind whipped across the grass, carrying the scent of earth and wildflowers, tangling Cora's hair like an untamed flame refusing to die. They stood close, yet between them stretched the unspoken weight of 1,000 unsaid things. Elias looked at her for a long, unhurried moment, as though engraving every line of her face into a place no one could take from him. His gaze held the warmth of a hearth in a winter storm, but also the unyielding resolve of a man who had found something he could never afford to lose. "Cora." He spoke her name like a prayer, but his voice was steady and sure. "I love you." Her breath caught. Her heart pounded as if she had just crossed an entire desert. For so long she had built her walls from steel and sand, but his words pierced through all of it. The wind stung her eyes, making them glisten. She stepped closer, until she could hear the beat of his heart. "I love you too," she said, her voice cutting through the last knot that had bound her for years. Neither of them stayed still. Elias pulled her to him, hard enough that she felt the press of his scar against her. The kiss came like a sudden downpour over parched earth, not gentle, but a surrender, a release, an admission. Their hearts beat in the same rhythm, merging with the sound of the wind sweeping over the hillside. And in that moment, two people who had once been utterly alone became a single flame, burning bright enough to defy the darkness rising from the horizon.